It's so good to have you on the podcast. And absolutely. And thanks for taking the time early in the morning. Been a big fan of your work, and you've been really helpful in really helping me brainstorm as to how I should think through my career. So I really, really admire, your contribution to my life. And I feel like you really stand for what or how we want to structure our Women Who Build community. And so I really appreciate all the contribution. Thanks so much. I would actually like to start with your background. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in the world of venture?
Sure, happy to. And thanks for having me on. It's such a fun thing to be able to do with you. I am from Wisconsin originally, so in the middle of the country, and grew up in a family that very few people worked in business. And so my dad's a lawyer, my mom is a teacher, and I had family members who were in law and government. And so business was pretty far outside of the world that I knew. But I was raised with really strong values around community and responsibility, and also I would say intellectual curiosity. And so had amazing education, and it was both social education, but also a lot of the education that I had happened at home through discovering books or going to museums or traveling. And that really created in me this deep desire to understand how things work and how the world comes together, like how systems interplay with one another. And for me, what I would say changed the trajectory of my life most significantly was going to Harvard for undergrad. And so I was not planning on going, but had a chance to see the campus and really fell in love with it when I was out for a speech and debate tournament during high school. And I then decided to apply and was fortunate enough to get in, and also got enough financial aid to make it possible for my family. And being at Harvard was this new opportunity to really discover my intellectual self on a whole new level because of the access and just the caliber of teaching and other classmates that I was around when I was at Harvard. But once again, I didn't turn to business. So I did work at the intersection of the environment, which will come back, so environmental engineering and economics, and specifically focused on water. And so did a lot of work in the Middle East, focused on water pricing, and thought I would do that for my life and my career, but got disillusioned with the way I saw decision-making being made in large NGOs like the World Bank. I saw a lot of it was based on politics or tenure and not necessarily evidence or data. And so I wanted to be at a place that I felt was more meritocratic, and then also that was data-based. And so for the first time as I was leaving undergrad, I actually looked to the private sector. And I ended up accidentally, I would say, I wasn't very strategic in what I was doing, but I found myself at a venture-backed startup in the predictive analytics space. And so it's an enterprise software company. So that means we're selling software as a service subscriptions to large corporate clients. And the work that we were embedding in the software was the same research as I had done in all my thesis research. So it's all applied experimentation. And so there was a very natural tie-in between the past academic work that I had done and then this new world of business. Even though it was a brand new world, it was like, it felt very familiar. And so I had the chance then to actually scale up with that company as the company grew. And so being at a smaller company, there are so many things you need to do where you're growing really quickly. And so they were always looking for people who were young and hungry and eager to take on increasing amounts of responsibility. And so it was this amazing place where I was really able to blossom in my own impact, both as a leader and a mentor and a manager, and then also in terms of my business understanding and acumen. We took on multiple rounds of funding and then ended up being acquired by Mastercard in 2015. So then I stayed on for about 9 months and then actually left to go to business school. And one of the reasons I left was because I was very interested in understanding if investing would be a fit for me. And it had never been something I had considered before. I had no background in finance or accounting, so some of the core fundamental building blocks you need. But I knew that I loved learning, like I've talked about. So I always loved discovering and understanding and putting pieces together. I also knew that I loved people. And so something that's amazing about investing is the fundamental currency of what you have is trust and credibility. And so that was something that really excited me about investing. And then I also loved the opportunity to help other founders who are on the journey of building a big company go through that scaling moment that I did with this startup. And so helping to, once you have product market fit, how do you make it really big and really successful? And so I loved the idea of being able to take that and support many other people in doing it, really being behind the scenes as a supporter or coach. And so I got to Stanford Business School, which is this cradle of venture and technology and innovation. Also a beautiful, beautiful environment. Like always sunny in 75. And like had I gone to Stanford's campus before I went to undergrad, I probably would have had a very different life because I just would have gone to Stanford. But anyway, so I got there and I was very fortunate to find my way into an early stage venture firm, Cowboy Ventures, run by an amazing woman, Aileen. And I was working term time, like as an MBA intern, supporting deal flow, doing analysis of different markets, portfolio work, so kind of the full set of what venture was. And that enabled me to confirm that I really loved being on the investing side, so I wanted to switch sides. But I also missed, so that it was a really early stage firm, so it was first capital in, and tons of respect for that, but I realized I was more of a 1 to infinity person than a 0 to 1 person. And so I was excited to support, or I wanted to get to the place where I could actually be more of the late stage venture investor rather than the early stage venture. And I knew I needed to actually develop the toolkit to do that, which is a more quantitative toolkit. And so as you heard, I had a pretty rigorous background in engineering, math, and science. And so I felt I could learn it, but I had to prove it. And so I spent a lot of time basically developing those skills, and then got an internship with KKR between my first and second year, got the return offer, and then was there for a couple of years really building that toolkit before coming over to Bain Capital in early 2020.
I mean, that's a wonderful background. And I think I really like the fact that you mentioned developing a toolkit, because there are so many people who are so inquisitive about venture and who want to get into venture. But I think one thing or one advice that I always got from people is that when you want to get into venture, you start doing things that a venture capitalist would do, right? So start building that toolkit already, start identifying those
things. Love that. That's a great way of putting it.
Absolutely. So I think what I'm really curious about, since you mentioned Alien, that's how Aileen, that's how you pronounce her name?
Yeah.
How is it working with her?
Yeah, it's amazing because she has such a brand and halo around her. And so I would say for the first bit, I was so starstruck. I mean, for those who don't know, she coined the term unicorn. And so to describe a company that has is valued at over $1 billion. And she also has developed one of the most important women's venture networks called Always. And that has chapters around the world and is a really important source of support. And so bringing new folks in, supporting them when they're here. And so she really thinks about these broad opportunities for change, in addition to being just a really kick-ass investor. And so it was one of the, I think working with her was so meaningful because I was able to see what excellent looks like immediately in my venture career. And that can be hard to do because when you're getting started, sometimes you have to start with what you can get. And so I was just extremely fortunate to be in the position of working with someone who is literally a legend in venture.
No, that's incredible. I would love to know more about your role at BCV. What are the type of companies that you're looking at? What is the stage? You mentioned growth equity. When you start? because there are different terminologies for growth equity in India and the US. So when do you start?
No, totally. Growth is a very large word. So at Bain Capital Ventures, I'm a partner, and the way that we think about the mandate of BCV, so it's $1.5 billion fund. It's Fund 10 that we're investing out of, and we invest both at the early stage, and then growth stage.
Yeah.
Or late stage, whatever you want to call it. And so the earliest stages are pre-seed and seed, sometimes Series A. And the way we think about it is we're trying to back the best founders as early as possible. And that's what the early stage team is focused on. And then the growth team is focused on the Series B plus opportunities.
Got it.
And so, and so we think about growth as really being post-product market fit. So once you've nailed your business, how are you scaling the idea and making it really big? And the only other thing I'd say from a structure perspective is BCD has 4 domains of focus, and we are very deep thematic experts. And so rather than investing in everything, we're focused on areas where we've developed a lot of, we have a prepared mind around what are the key themes that are developing or changing a space. And so at BCD, across both early and late stage, it's fintech, commerce tech, application software, and infrastructure and security.
Got it. Yeah, I think I'd love to dive deeper into fintech and in specific. I think before we even do that, we've seen that the macro environment is changing. Firstly, most investors haven't really seen an era of high inflation interest rates that we are in. Secondly, the influence of the government across markets and businesses is increasing. For example, the IRA is a clear example of that. So how has that really impacted the kind of sectors that you dive into or your investing styles? So for example, the most recent deal that you did, it mentioned how it's your first investment into climate. So how did you really come up with the idea of investing in climate, that now is the right time to go about it, given the macro?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So my partners, RF and Kevin, led the deal on Lithos Carbon, which exactly as you said is our first technical climate deal. Although, as we'll get into, climate is a amorphous term, that there are other investments that we've made in our portfolio that I think also have sustainability or climate angles as well, which is exciting.
Yeah.
So for us, as I mentioned, we have those 4 domains of focus. And the reason why that matters is because those imply certain business models. And so SaaS is obviously a recurring revenue for application layer delivery. And then within fintech, you could have payments models, or you could have infrastructure models, you could have lending models, financing models, et cetera. And then within commerce tech, you have quite a few marketplace models. And so these are all different business models that are relevant within these spaces. And the way that we thought about climate is that climate is basically a really important lens to apply to all of these core domains where we already have experience and focus.
Yeah.
And so we're not thinking about climate as a whole new thing that's totally dissimilar from what we've done before, but rather we're saying, let's take application software. So that is horizontal SaaS, and then also vertical SaaS within specific markets. So from a horizontal SaaS perspective, climate software includes supply chain traceability software. And so helping large consumer packaged good companies understand the source of their goods all the way through the supply chain and being able to map that up, as well as applying an understanding of carbon emissions, for example. And so as companies are being asked to attest to their Scope 3 emissions, they need software to actually trace through their supply chain. So that's one example that's horizontal. An example that's vertical would be software that helps installers of solar panels at houses or installers of heat pumps at houses actually map out the design of those systems within houses in order to price the project appropriately and order the right parts in order to have them come to the house. And so that is a whole new domain field that, to your point of the IRA, has a ton of investment behind it. And so therefore also needs like software to support it, because right now a lot of it is done by paper and pen by a much smaller number of installers than we need to have to actually support the market. And so we're not approaching climate as a whole new thing. Rather, what we're saying is that we can be really useful investors into the climate space, leveraging the experience that we have as generalist investors from these other areas, because there are direct applications into climate. And so the way I think about it is climate is a reason why now for a solution. And so why now is that we have emissions growing as the criticality of curbing emissions has increased. We have a growing awareness among consumers and an eagerness to actually address climate change. We have a growing awareness around government and a number of different new regulatory programs such as IRA, and then there's many more in Europe and the rest of the world. We have a growing awareness of business, and some of that is brought on by expectations of consumers, expectations of other stakeholders, also of regulatory attestations around emissions and use. And so all of these things are creating the demand swell that is requiring those in the ecosystem to actually address climate. And so we see that as one of the big trends of our time, and a really exciting space to invest against for that reason, because we think large companies will be created. And then the final element of it that I'd share of why climate is that we also see amazing teams going into the space. And so I would say every day we have like a talent channel in our Slack at work. And on a daily basis, there are folks who are coming from great tech firms, standard tech firms, right? Like in fintech or application software, or whatever, and are looking to leave to go to a climate focused company. And I think people are desiring an alignment between mission and work. And we're seeing climate really be the beneficiary of that. And so one thing that we've identified is that where good talent is going, there's a lot of great companies to build.
Yeah. I think to your second point around, why now for climate? So specifically for software companies, do you think the return or the duration that you look for within climate will be similar to how you evaluate other types of companies as well? Given that, what I'm hearing is that business models can be similar in the back end. So for example, it can be a B2B SaaS company, but the problem statement is different. And so how do you think through that?
Yeah, very well put. And we're specifically looking for opportunities where that's true. And so what you're touching on is a great point, that there are, I think the types of companies that exist in climate is very broad. There are a number of batteries companies or manufacturing companies or physics companies, right? There are companies that are creating new forms of cement or new forms of textiles that are also like carbon sequestration activities. And so we've had discussions internally around what are the types of risk we want to underwrite, or so what are the types of risk we want to take. And so to your point, we are looking for business models that resemble the commercial risk that we generally take in the other forms of investing that we do. And I don't think the time horizon is any different for that. And so there are definitely examples of climate investing where you're not going to see a return for 15 years because of tech risk, but those aren't the ones that we're doing. We're focused instead on opportunities that there's a need today, there's a team who has the right background to build in that space, and then they have something that they have developed at different stages depending on where they're in their life cycle, and they're commercializing now.
Yeah, makes sense. And then I think one thing that everyone's been, or maybe this one question that everyone's been asking us, at least at Orioles, since we have a very deep focus on climate, is that what do you really think needs to be financed currently? And how do you really put that into perspective, right after the passing of the IRA? Also, who funds what, given there are different types of investment companies now that are investing in climate. So what needs to be financed and who will fund what?
Totally. Yeah, it's a great question because we recently had a dinner with other climate investors, and this is one of the key topics as well. So I really appreciate it. And we're in an environment right now where generally that there's capital, the cost of capital has gone up. And I think there's a lot of conservatism from many lending organizations or those who have large balance sheets about lending as well. And so what we've seen across climate, and this is less true in the spaces where we invest, but what we've seen across climate is that oftentimes companies have to raise equity to replace what otherwise would be a debt instrument, because the debt isn't available for project financing in the same way that it might be in other more traditional industries.
Yeah.
But for us, so generally speaking, we're looking at low asset, like low hardware models. And so it's less relevant. The places where we are directly thinking about financing is actually in the residential space, though. And so, for example, there's a really interesting relationship between the bank as an entity, and it could be a traditional bank, it could be a neobank, whatever, but the bank as an entity providing financial services to a small business or a homeowner, and having recognition that now the climate space is part of what that homeowner is interested in, or that small business is interested in. They could make financing available to actually support some of those purchases. And so either being a company that's helping enable banks to do that, or being a company that's direct to consumer or direct to business, more of a marketplace model around it, or being one that is the infrastructure that's bringing together multiple players. And so there are many different models that we believe will come together in the financing space.
Yeah.
And then the other element of it I would just add is insurance too, where there's obviously a lot of capacity that you need to underwrite insurance. And we are seeing a lot of eagerness from larger reinsurers to address some of the risk that comes along with climate change.
Yeah. I mean, since I'm actually curious, how are insurance companies really working with startups at this point, given I feel like homeowners insurance opportunity is huge here. So how are they really working with startups? And, they are traditionally known to be a bit difficult to work with, both actually utilities and insurance. And I think there'll be a mixed play here. So how have you seen playing out?
Yeah, totally. So I agree. I think the insurance industry is, a lot of the companies are over 100 years old, right? And part of the premise is that they have to be conservative in order to act as the safety net that insurance is for everyone, for all the insurance. And so there's a really important balance between innovation and conservatism that's always at play in insurance. And I've seen many different models work of the relationship between insurtechs and insurance companies. And obviously there are many different types of insurance companies, right? You have brokers, you have MGAs, you have carriers, you have reinsurers, et cetera. One is that the insurtech is a provider to a traditional insurance company. And so it could be a data provider, it could be a technology provider. And so then that insurtech is trying to prove that their solution is better than the incumbent solution that the insurance entity is using. You also have insurtechs that are trying to compete with incumbents. And so it could be that there's an MGA, which is trying to sell climate insurance, leveraging models, for example, that are better at identifying risk than what the incumbent carriers are able to do. And so I think we've seen a lot of different models, and it's still a very new space. It's still a very young space. And so I think it's an area, if you look over the next 5 to 10 years, to your point, the size of the risk pool in insurance against climate is huge. But figuring out how to make the risk something that insurers understand and want to underwrite is still in development.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, just turning to general fintech. In fintech, B2C companies have underperformed B2B companies, and customer acquisition costs and unit economics have been lopsided in many B2C companies. So how are you thinking through your investments, and how do you sort of evaluate B2C versus B2B companies now, or any specific benchmarks that you have there?
Yeah, so we don't do a lot of B2C investing, honestly. And that is, I think part of it is the legacy of, within Bain Capital, we have this amazing position where we see a lot of B2B, because our portfolio at BCV is quite significant, but then also we have the benefit of the rest of the portfolio across Bain Capital that we have a chance to interact with on a regular basis. And so from the position of where are we differentiated, we're focused more on B2B opportunities. I think just commenting quickly on fintech, when it comes to B2C, we think about, and we write and talk a lot about this, that there are different waves of fintech. And so fintech 1.0, and we can call it, well, I'll talk about insurtech, but I think it was true in fintech more broadly. Insurtech 1.0 was about innovating on distribution. And so it was this identification that a lot of the incumbent carriers, for the reasons we were just talking about in climate insurance, they're conservative. And so the way that they were addressing potential customers and existing insureds was through a pretty pen and paper, old school approach. And so it took a lot of information to get a quote, and it was very slow. And when you wanted to change something, it was like really clunky and whatever. And so there's a whole wave of insurtechs, a whole crop, who said, we should have digital first. Consumers want it. This is a much better delivery mechanism. And they were totally right. It's much better to have distribution that's digital. And so their innovation was actually changing out the front end, but a lot of what the product itself was very similar, not exactly the similar, and people would debate that, but there were more similarities with the product itself. The challenge is that incumbent carriers saw that and were like, yeah, that's a good idea. Agreed. And so incumbent carriers were able to just do the exact same thing. And then they had this advantage of brand, having been around for hundreds of years, 100 years. But then also they had this advantage of just heft and scale and size. And so they were able to outspend, from a CAC perspective, the new insurtechs. And there was also this challenge where there was the wrong risk. Some insurtechs were getting the wrong risk. And so by just focused online distribution, the folks who were purchasing policies were more likely to be younger and more likely to shop around, because it's so easy to shop around online. And so there was more risk, and also the retention was lower. And so it was this like double whammy of economics, of the higher cost and then lower lifetime value of these customers. And so that's been a really, really hard slog for these companies in this InsurTech 1.0 space. InsurTech 2.0, where I'm really excited, is more on innovation and underwriting. And so if you kind of take one step back in the insurance value chain, underwriting is all about understanding the underlying risk of a prospect in order to do a quote, or like a policy holder, and giving the right price based on what that risk profile looks like. And so it's where there's an advantage that comes from new forms of data. There's an advantage from machine learning and AI. There's an advantage from the relationship that an insurance company can have with an insured to help them actually change and improve behavior over time to decrease risk and decrease cost. And so that's a space that we're pretty excited and spending a lot of time.
Yeah. And would you talk about insurance and climate in some shape or form? Is that happening at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So there are examples of it. I mean, yesterday I had lunch with a founder who's building in the climate insurance space, and so it's a team that developed. It's a ex academic research team in climate modeling, and they have a much more accurate model to identify wildfire risk, and, as I was saying, actually mitigate the risk. And so they can identify the sources of the risk for a risk score in a property, and then also what that homeowner could do to reduce the risk.
Right.
And so it's huge. It's like especially being in Northern California, it's a really big deal. And so that's just one example. We're also seeing it. I think another exciting space is parametric insurance. So parametric insurance is there's basically a binary outcome that's determined of whether or not a payout occurs. And so if it rains more than 3 inches, then automatically a payout goes out. And so there's a lot of folks in the industry are excited about parametric when it comes to climate, because climate can be really hard to cost. So it's really hard to know how big the loss ratio will be for damages with some of these really big weather events. But instead, with parametric, if it's a defined payout, so it's a defined amount and it's a defined event that happens, it reduces a lot of the complexity around it, and then also how much insurance companies have to withhold in order to be able to pay. And so it simplifies quite a bit. And so we're seeing a lot of weather-related parametric insurance companies as well.
And then are you seeing these models that are, a combination of hardware and data then? Because then for you to be able to extract the right amount of data, and if data is the differentiation, then I'm guessing there needs to be some hardware in place, IoT and stuff, to be able to.
Totally.
Yeah.
So to your point, there often is some element of some hardware, be it drones or sensors on cars if it's commercial fleet or whatever. But what we're looking for is that the hardware itself is not the intellectual property.
Sure.
And so what I mean by that is the hardware could be, you can substitute one of, 20 different suppliers who creates this hardware. And that's really important because then you're not incumbent on just one hardware provider. And also you don't have to own the entire supply chain in order to deliver your services.
Yeah.
And so we prefer that the insight or the innovation is around the data that's being captured from the hardware rather than the hardware itself.
Makes sense. Cool. And then now just getting to the overall portfolio. So obviously there is more focus now on profitability and building enduring businesses, which should be key anyway. And it's also exemplified by a recent article on COGS. And as public markets actually try to value, or hopefully they're valuing it right, they value profitability over revenue growth. Does that elongate your hold periods for investments to get companies towards paths to profitability before exit? And what does that mean for returns overall?
Yeah, no, great questions. I would say the big shift that happened is that the cost of capital increased. And so the decisions that made sense before in an optimal environment have changed. And so that's why I think we're seeing a change in, just yesterday, there were a number of large layoffs that happened across a number of tech companies because the hiring decisions that were made in the lower cost of capital environment no longer made sense. And so that's happening, on a big level in the news, but also we're seeing that on a more micro level across companies. So does it change the hold period? I think probably not. Obviously we'll have to see, and we don't know what we don't know, but I think the growth path of companies is probably going to be less aggressive overall, but the best companies will still see outsized growth, and they'll be coupled with more of an awareness on efficiency too. And so I think the bigger impact is that there's going to be more of a gap between the best companies and not the best companies.
Yeah.
And so whereas before there was more of a linear relationship between company quality and company valuation, and so it was kind of like a line that sloped down, I think we're instead seeing more of a stair step where the best companies are still achieving great valuations and have amazing growth plus efficiency. And then there's more of a gap with the companies that perhaps had a great product and a lot of customer love, but we're spending a lot to get it. And so just are not as efficient. And that business model will be harder to sustain in a higher cost of capital environment.
Yeah. Actually, this is one of the questions that almost all portfolio companies ask, is that we have a limited runway. Some companies have, 18, 20 months runway, which is ideal. But that doesn't mean that they will, go crazy and spend a lot on marketing and stuff, right? But then while they are being conservative, how much conservatism is too much conservatism, right? When do you know that because you start for some reason, right? And it's different from traditional businesses for some reason. And so how do you sort of think through that?
Yeah, totally. I don't think the right takeaway is not to spend, to your point. And I think rather it is to be really diligent about not spending until you have evidence of success. And so there is less there is less ability to experiment on many things at once. Like you can't have, just to make it tangible, you can't have 6 different teams of engineers experimenting on new products at once, but rather you have to say, I'm going to rank order these opportunities based on market size and what customers need and like where there's potential attachment. And I'm going to have one team do it first, see if it works, and then go on to the next one. So it's more sequential. And for companies that have found something and it's working, we want to spend more. We want to spend into that opportunity because it's coming at a time when other companies are pulling back. And so this, I think, is one of the mechanisms of what I was talking about earlier, of how the best companies are going to be separated more from the companies that are not the best companies.
So in a way, they should have predicted it right anyway.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Well, sorry, when you say predicted it, I'm saying we're not asking everyone to get to profitability. And in fact, there is a good argument that if you found something that works really well, you should spend more in order to grab market share.
Yeah.
And so it's a nuanced conversation that you have to have depending on what evidence you have around the success of the model that you're building.
Right. Yeah. And then in this case, when you don't have, so obviously every portfolio, even the best investors have a portfolio where there are great companies and then there are like some not so good companies. And so how do you sort of communicate with the not so good companies at this point, and what do you tell them?
Yeah, so I think the way that we show up as investors is critically important across that entire spectrum of company performance. And I think the types of things that matter, and this isn't a complete answer, but the types of things that matter are over communication on both sides. And so sharing like what does success look like and what are the metrics to hit, and if we don't hit that, what does that imply and what does that mean and what are the trade-offs? And so the problems happen on either sides when there's not when things are surprises, right? Like when it's not expected that there's a path. And companies that are not like the best companies are still amazing. Like there are great outcomes that can happen. And I think the way that we support entrepreneurs at wherever they are in the journey becomes a really important badge of who we are as investors. And I would say everyone asks that question of, tell me a story about investment that didn't work out, and what would that founder say about you?
Makes sense. And then some personal questions. You're active on Twitter. I follow you every day. And specifically for the podcast, I stalked you so much and I fell in love with your Twitter feeds. So how do you really plan your tweets? Because many people really struggle to take the first step. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I struggle to take the first step too. I still struggle to take steps. It's such a funny thing. I definitely would say I haven't figured out. I think the biggest learning for me as I got started was to decrease the threshold of perfection that I held myself to. I think when I'm putting together a presentation or when I'm running a blog post or whatever, there's much more focus on excellent language, precision, everything. But in Twitter, it's more fleeting. And so I think there's an opportunity to get more ideas out. And so I try to lower the threshold of what I'm sharing. And so that's resulted in, as you've seen, some very raw recollections of conversations or reflections of what people are sharing, or very personal, like this is what happened or this is what's going on. And I've enjoyed that because I think it's an opportunity to actually share more of my personality than is otherwise possible when we're, each in our own little Zoom boxes around the world doing our own work.
Yeah. And why do you think that's important?
Because it gets back to what I was saying on why I wanted to do investing, which is that it's fundamentally about people. And so investing is about a founder works with an investor that they trust, that they like, that they feel is really going to be transformative to the business, like is the best thing that they can do for the business is work with a particular investor. An investor is looking to work with a founder that they trust, that they believe in, that they believe is going to build an incredible business. And so that requires knowing each other and having respect and understanding. And so again, I think it's in this world where we are increasingly separated, we're virtually together, but increasingly separated. It's not always possible to get a full sense of who someone is. And I see blogging or Twitter as a way to share a little bit more of myself. And I've also really appreciated being able to follow other people as well and get to know them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just talking about this amazing tweet from you, which is making it is working with your friends, the people you trust, admire, respect, love, partnering with them, investing in them, and building with them. Now, this really struck me as I've been thinking really deeply about how I want the partnerships in my life to work. What are the kind of partners that I want? I've also started to realize that, be it in your personal life or your professional life, your values, your ambitions, intentions, etc., should more likely match, at least for me. And so I'm actually curious how you're thinking through these partnerships in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about it as it's decisions that we make structurally, and then it's also the decisions that we make every day. And so, in the professional space, the decision to join BCV was a really big one, right? Of meeting on a personal level and a professional level with the partnership and understanding who they were and the opportunity to work for decades together and be part of building something together. And that's also why when more often than not, when we're investing in a founder, we've known them over a long period of time because we've gotten that relationship over time. On a personal level too, it's like I would say, especially being a mom, the partner that you have in life. Yeah. For me, my husband is like the most important decision, right, that I've made. And so like that's another form of partnership. But what I try to do is I try to spend the time in the relationships that I have with people, getting to know the business and the company, but also getting to know them as people, because the motivations that someone has as to why they're building or what they're doing or what they've seen before, I think that is a more important part of what they'll do in the future than just what they're doing today. And so I think if you just look at the surface layer, you'll miss a lot of the way that someone over time will continue to be shaped. Versus if you see the underlying pieces of someone, then you'll have a better sense of what the future looks like. And so that's something I'm very aware of as I'm developing relationships with founders.
So the why is really important. And how do you really determine that why? Because, there are so many factors to take into account. Obviously, you don't sweat on it, but how do you really figure out
why someone's building?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we often, so Zoom is pretty transactional, right? So like you're getting on and you're like, here's my background, here's your background, here's the pitch, here's slides. Like it can feel transactional, and sometimes it's hard to add more of the personal there. But increasingly spending time before an investment with people in person, but then also before any investment, spending time in person. Sorry, and that in-person time is really helpful to, like when you're walking into the room or when you're waiting for the server to like come and take your order. Those are the shoulder opportunities to ask people about themselves and their lives and what brought them here and the motivations. And so I think it actually comes really naturally when you're in person.
Yeah. And then you're a sailor. So how has that really shaped you as a person, as a professional, as who you are, as a partner, mom,
Yeah. It's great. Yeah. So sailing is a great metaphor for life, I think. So sailing it's a physics feat, really, that you can have wind coming from one direction and the boat will go the other.
Yeah.
And that's because of the keel underneath and whatever. I won't get into the science of it, but it's cool when you know that side of it. And I think what I love about sailing is that the sailor has to be ready to adjust to the conditions, because a motorboat has a motor that you can like go in one direction with like the pure power of the motor.
Yeah.
But as a sailor, when the wind changes directions and I want to go in a certain direction, I have to be able to change the boat and then change the sails in order to accommodate the wind. And so I think it's a lesson in recognizing that we can't change what we can't change. Like, we can't control everything, but what we can control is what we can control. And so keeping that separate and being flexible to adjust based on the conditions of the time. And so it's a very meta, it's like it's a way of being in the world that I think is really helpful. And I think it creates a fundamental sense of peace as well. Once I understand that I need to let go of what I cannot control, it makes things a lot more simple. And I think it makes the journey a lot more fun too.
Absolutely. How long did it take you to learn how to sail? And when did you start?
Yeah, I grew up sailing. So I don't
wow.
So my family, I grew up in Lake Michigan, and my dad started sailing when he was a teenager. And so I was really lucky that we always had a boat in Milwaukee, and we lived like right up the bluff from it. And so it was less than 5 minutes driving to get to the boat, and we would go out all the time. And so it was something I grew up with.
Do you want your baby to learn how to sail?
He is learning how to sail.
Already?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. He doesn't understand anything I say to him right now. He's 18 months old, but he loves being out on the water, and he's fearless already. And so it's a little things now that he's learning about having sea legs and what it feels to be on the water. And so the first step in learning that is just being comfortable with the discomfort that is true being in the water. So I'm very excited for him to learn it. And my husband's a big sailor too, and he did not sail growing up, but he realized how much I loved it and then learned. So it's really cool. He got his captain's license on San Francisco Bay, learning how to do it.
Very cool. And is your partner an investor as well, or what does he do?
He's a crypto founder.
Whoa!
I know. He built a data analytics company in the NFT space, actually. So sometimes my Zoom connection gets bad because he's using too much data. No, I'm just kidding.
But interesting fintech conversations, dinner table conversations, is it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's fun to have. He's been an investor before. He's worked in investing, and so, and I also there's deep empathy when you see your partner building something, how hard it is, right? And how hard to feel so alone so often by having, there's a fundamental conviction that every founder has in the need for something to exist in the world that doesn't. And so it's this belief of the future, and then this strong desire to make that future true. And that's usually what's at the heart of it. And so I've seen with him this journey, and it's a much deeper empathy than I've ever had before, seeing it firsthand.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for doing this with me. I had a wonderful time chatting, and thank you so much, and good luck for everything that you do.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.